in celebration, I guess, of the 2018 midterm elections, I wanted to do a little video on voting. This is, I don't get too enmeshed in regular routine politics. Obviously, it's interesting at some level. Um, when there's no candidate or issue that I find particularly laudatory, I check out in terms of my emotions with the election. They can still be fun to watch, and you invariably get awash in this rhetoric of the positive aspect of voting. Voting is seen as extremely positive. There's a tremendous amount of virtue signaling and even sincere belief that this is, one of the most sanctified acts that you can commit. And in the course of people discussing this, I've opined a couple times just to let it be put out there that I just don't think that voting is that vital. Now, I'm not one to say that voting is necessarily morally wrong, although I think it is morally suspect, at least in certain situations. I believe, though, that if you want to engage in defensive voting, sure. If you want to make the argument that there's some utility in picking the lesser of two evils, especially if one of the evils is significantly worse than the other, sure, I'm not going to criticize people doing that. There are certainly issues that I care enough about that if they were crystallized into a ballot casting situation, that I might be motivated to do it myself. Uh, However, in the vast majority of situations, there's quite a lot of separation between the representatives that you're casting ballots for and the actual policy decisions that you care about. And furthermore, again, when we're talking about representative democracy, uh, usually the differences between the candidates, or at least the candidates who have um, any chance of winning, is significantly small, that even if there are differences, they're not worth the effort to go and vote. And this is, of course, ignoring the fact that the chances that your individual vote makes any difference are quite small. But I wanted to kind of talk about why voting might have this. Voting serves a really important role in terms of the legitimization of the state. Now, I don't think that it provides the authority or the legitimization that most people think, but its role in making most people believe that is pretty high. So, if you look, I think that the main purpose of voting is to get a larger portion of the population, certainly not everyone, but a larger portion of the population to feel like that they are invested with the state, that they have a say in the state, that the state, quote, is them, or that we are democracy, and that this is, for the most part, a method of controlling the populace, not the other way around. It's really interesting historically. I've done a lot of reading in the last couple of years that didn't address this directly, but if you look, like say, in military history or political history, we have this phenomenon where early early or not early modern, like ancient societies that had enfranchisement, that had democracy or republican values, stupendously outperformed societies that may have been larger and richer but did not. So the most classic example here would be Greece. You had all these city-states in Greece. Greece isn't the nation-state that we recognize it today, but a series of culturally similar and maybe even politically similar, if not politically aligned, city-states. And although they varied in structure to some degrees, most of them had some degree of enfranchisement where all adult males anyway, or at least property owning males, would have a say in the government. And then you juxtapose that with the typical type of state that existed at the time. Some type of oligarchy or monarchy, or religious dictatorship. Say the Persian Empire or in Egypt. And the Persian Empire or Egypt, these are empires that ruled vastly larger areas with large, much greater populations and more wealth and presumably even more technology, and yet they were crushed, at least sometimes, not always, by the military output of relatively small areas. And this is reflected later in the history of Rome. If one of the basic facts about, and we can talk about the efficacy of the Roman legions, and there's a point there, but there were other effective military units at the time. There was other effective military technology, but the Romans just had this advantage that they could basically use their entire male population in the military, and that's something that you couldn't say for Carthage or for any of the other societies. Now, I think it might be something that you can say for like pre-civilized nations, tribal nations or whatever, where you don't have a formal military and everybody is in arms, has some martial skill and could have some element of martial ability. And those societies are actually probably for that reason relatively egalitarian. But we have this, because people are invested, the state then has their allegiance to a degree that they don't have. The emperor of the Persians really couldn't expect that many of his subjects to care enough to be good soldiers. He might be able to draft them, he might be able to coerce them into the army, and get them to do a little bit, but not to that high of a degree. They wouldn't be that powerful an instrument. If there was a disaster, they'd all run away. They wouldn't be this dedicated body, and to the extent that the Greeks were anyway, or the Romans were. And we look at our modern history, we kind of see a similar thing where a desire to harness the military potential of a population leads to wider enfranchisement. So we see this in the American Civil War, for instance, where the use of blacks in both the North and then less well known, but actually maybe more crucially in the South, led to both the North and the South to start thinking in terms of allowing blacks to vote. We want blacks to fight for us. We want their military muscle. Then the obvious payoff for that to them, the obvious incentive is to give them voting rights or equal rights. In the case of the South, the obvious thing was emancipation. And I've done videos on this before, but there's a really good book called The Black and the Gray about Confederate debates about this. And in the Confederate itself, there is this kind of interesting split between people who seceded primarily because they believed in slavery and they wanted to defend slavery and they thought secession was the best way to protect slavery. On the other hand, you had people who also wanted to protect slavery and thought the best way to protect slavery was to remain in the Union. So there's some interesting articles saying that the greatest friend, the greatest shield of slavery was the Union, the federal government. And on the other hand, you had other politicians who believed that it was more about independence and that, yes, slavery was an important issue. That's something they cared about. They wanted to have political independence, and if they had to end slavery to get it, they would be willing to do it. And so a lot of times when we have this debate, people will throw out this quote by Stephen Toombs, the vice president of the Confederacy, saying, the great truth that the Confederate States is founded on the great truth of the inequality of the black man. Fair enough. That is his legitimate opinion, and that was the opinion of many people in the South. What that doesn't ignores, though, is that Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, the two people who definitely had more power and more influence in the South than Stephen Toombs did, believed basically the opposite. Now, that's not to say they weren't white supremacists. They were, just like the people in the North were. But they valued independence and political autonomy more than slavery and were willing, when it came down to it, to sacrifice slavery to that end. Now, did the South get to the point where they emancipated their slaves? No. But they had basically come to the conclusion that that was going to be necessary if they wanted to harness black troops, and that's what they started to do in 1864 and the spring of 1865, literally in the last month or two of the war. But we saw the same process in the North, where it's an understood, we can't expect people to fight so hard for us if we're not going to get them. And in World War I, you see that war led to the enfranchisement of more people and indeed of women. You look at people like Lloyd George or Woodrow Wilson, who they wanted all of society to be united behind a single effort, and that effort would obviously be run by the state, and yet you have large sections of the population that are not do not have any kind of say in the state, that are basically disenfranchised, whether it be propertyless men or certain minorities or women, get on board, give us your effort, give us 100%, and in return you have, this bone. You can vote. And I think that this strategy has been extremely successful because the tangible benefits of voting are vanishingly tiny. I mean, the arguments for it are quite silly. I was having a fairly cordial Facebook debate about this, and I was pointing out that voters are overwhelmingly ignorant when it comes to political issues anyway. Now, I'm not saying that people are overwhelmingly ignorant about everything or that they should know about everything, right? I'm ignorant about an infinite number of subjects, as could be said of anyone. Your everyday person, they know about their job, they know about their family, they might understand the intricacies of the interpersonal relationships between them and their spouse or their friends or their coworkers. And a lot of people cultivate hobbies where they're fairly expert, where they know a lot, but this doesn't translate into expertise when it comes to politics. So surveys of this are just abysmal. The number of people who can name the vice president, the number of people who can list how many senators there are, the number of people who can name their congressman, the number of people who can list the last thing that their congressman voted on. I mean, that all of these are small, like minorities of people, even tiny minorities of people who are capable of doing these, and yet these are the most basic, fundamental expectations you would have to have. I mean, when you talk about the things that the state's going to legislate, whether it's economics or history or science or politics, people just don't know about these things, and yet there's this overwhelming belief that voting, ignorant, stupid people who don't know anything, have no moral character necessarily, that having them have a say is a great thing. It's a great thing from the point of view of the government. It's a great thing from the point of view of then saying, you're part of the state, you're culpable for our actions, you're responsible to us, and you've given us legitimacy. Because we've had these elections, we don't have the divine right of kings anymore. We don't have the mandate of heaven. We have the mandate of the ballot box. Now, the fact that process is subject to intense political influence, if not 100% control, and I think it's on the border between high influence and 100% control, but not quite, renders it kind of meaningless in terms of an effective control on the state. The elections are too infrequent. The electorate is defined. They can be gerrymandered. Who's allowed to vote? What's allowed to be on the ballot? Who counts the votes? I mean, we take it for granted that voter fraud or that vote falsification doesn't happen or is somehow minimal. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. We don't know. We have a terrible case of people doing oversight of themselves. But just even if it's not, just the process is just ridiculous in terms of manipulating results, the fact that, and there's specific problems with different types of voting. Direct democracy has several separate issues than representative democracy. So, the transference, the basket of issue problems that you have with representative democracy, where you're voting for a candidate who might believe in X, Y, and Z, and another candidate that believes in A, B, and C. And what do you do if you believe in X, A, and Z? How does that pan out? Of course, then there's the problem that politicians, the promises they make are non-binding. They can say whatever they want before the election. They are not bound to do anything as a result of it. They also have plausible deniability because of the political process. And so the degree of control this actually grants the citizenry as a whole is quite limited because they are presented with limited options. Limited in both when they are allowed to make choices and what those choices are. Like, we are never given choices of. Can you just imagine if every federal law was on the ballot and you could vote yay or nay? Granted that would be astronomically difficult, and who would know? But I think there would be a degree of control there that there certainly isn't now, because I think a lot of laws would be voted down, because a lot of laws are, in fact, perhaps even most laws, are there for special interest reasons. There's some group that sees a concentrated benefit from a diffused cost of having a certain law. That could be a direct subsidy or an indirect subsidy, whether it's a regulation or tax or whatever. But we're never provided that level of control, and probably with good reason. We definitely have a ruling elite. We definitely have an oligarchy. Uh, the membership of that oligarchy is not necessarily hereditary, so you can be a pleb and you can work your way up. You can become a powerful politician. You can become somebody who has influence over voting blocks, who has influence over government. You can become a lobbyist. There's lots of things that you can do. So it's not like a hereditary monarchy where you have to be a prince. This would be a big problem, say, in Tsarist Russia, where the avenues for your advancement would be quite limited if you weren't from the right group, and that just means that most people are not going to buy into the system. That's another thing. I've been reading a lot about the Russian Revolution right now, reading a book on it at the moment, and one of the big problems is you could join the army, but even there was drastic favoritism towards people from the nobility or from even certain ethnic groups. And so, yes, Russia had 150 million people, but very few of them had any kind of stake in the government. But how much stake do you actually have when your stake is just the ability to vote? A vote is not a share. It's not even like it's much. A lot of people own stock. If you own one stock in a company that's got 50 million shares of stock, do you really feel like you're gonna go and die for that company? No. But at least you own that share and you can transfer it, you can buy it, you can sell it, and you might even get dividends from it. And your vote, if you choose, if there's shareholder voting, if it's one share in 50 million, that's not great, but that's more than you get at the federal level in the United States. And I think there's argument here. If you're talking about a municipal government where 100 votes or 200 votes, fair enough. And again, I live in New Hampshire. I know a gay anarchist libertarian who has been elected to the state house, an old friend of mine. Well, not a friend, an acquaintance. Because the districts are small and the number of voters is small, it's possible to get elected with a small number and have the subsequent power of each legislature is then also subsequently reduced, right? It's because the legislature in New Hampshire is quite large, so the power of any individual representative is not very high. But so democracy kind of opens it up, and it's really kind of sinister because now they can have the elite are open up to basically everybody, but it's a meritocracy. So there's a lot of people who would like to have influence. There's a lot of people who, like me, for instance, who will put their political opinions out there. But only the most successful ones are going to rise to the level of somebody who has any kind of actual policy control or mass control. And if you're talking about being a politician, of exercising the power of governing, the kind of the problem with monarchies is you don't know. Like you could have a really high functioning, well educated monarch, or you could have one who's just who's a total moron, who's crazy, who's a sociopath. And one that can't even hide his sociopathic tendencies. Or you could have someone who's just kind of average, but they're not, Nicholas II, for instance, was basically kind of an average guy in terms of his abilities. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't mean-spirited. He was well-intentioned. He abdicated out of basically a patriotic desire to help, as he saw it, Russia. But he wasn't, of all the 100 million plus people in Russia at the time, he certainly was not like the most competitive, the most articulate, the most capable. Democracy kind of allows those people to matriculate to the top if they want. Of course, in a capitalist society, they have to compete with the fact that you can make a lot of money without being in the government, which is a great thing, which means we do have a lot of talent. A huge part of our talent pool is not devoting itself to government, which is glorious, which is wonderful. But then people will say, well, isn't that great that we have a meritocracy of the state? Like, not really, because the traits that are and virtues that are being selected for, that are matriculating to the top, are traits of political manipulation, of demagoguery, of double dealing, of being a liar, of being misleading, and so it doesn't really reward virtue most of the time. Maybe there are exceptions. There's the Ron Pauls of the world, but how many Ron Pauls are there? There's him, and there's less than 5 others ever from him, and he's inspired a lot of people. Even so, we're talking about like maybe Justin Amash, maybe one other in Congress today. So that's, what is that? A third of a percent of congressmen at that level. 1% of the senators if we count Rand Paul, and that's a big if we count Rand Paul. And even that would be unprecedented. So, but it really is an ingenious, and I don't know if this, I don't think that there was some evil genius who said, let's do this. I think it was a process that was wrested out of necessity. It was necessary to enfranchise larger parts of the population as modern states began basically war making. I mean, war making and state making, they're not just related, they may be completely vital to each other. The state making may not be possible without war making. There's obviously the famous Randolph Bourne quote, "War is the health of the state." I think it might be even more than that. That war is absolutely a precondition of the state growing anyway, or developing, or gaining more power. And enfranchising people doesn't reduce the power of the state. It actually increases the power of the state immeasurably, because people now can cast this ballot, but that doesn't mean that does not give them control in any meaningful sense. And we could talk about that. I've done videos to that effect. I think it's very hard to debate that the fact that you can cast a ballot gives you any meaningful control. I see people, but rhetorically, it seems to work with a lot of people. I remember when Obama was president, somebody saying that Obama is our servant, that he's our slave. Somebody cast again like, "Oh, just go and try and whip Obama for being a bad slave. Just see what happens." There is some rhetorical deference to the Church of Democracy, but in effect, practically speaking, we have an elite that they are our masters, essentially, to a very large degree. It could be an even larger degree. This could be the Soviet Union, and they could have the power of life or death at the snap of a fingers, which I think that they have somewhat here to a certain point, but not nearly to the point, say, of a pharaoh. Or a Politburo member, or a general secretary. But I think the actual control that you get by being able to vote is vanishingly small, but it gets people to buy in. People become enthusiastic. They become supporters. They feel like they are connected, that they have a personal stake in it, and for all of that enthusiasm, for all of that even love, for all of that authority, for all of that legitimacy, they're not really giving up very much, because you're not really controlling them, right? We had this huge election, millions of people voted. What's going to change tomorrow? It seems like Ruth Bader Ginsburg falling down was more important than all those votes cast. I mean, that may actually be true, that one woman, because she's on the Supreme Court, breaking 3 ribs and maybe getting replaced, is more significant than however many ballots were cast, with 100 million or 70 million or whatever it was. It's just kind of nauseating to see, I voted, voting's good. If you didn't vote, you can't complain. Again, I don't think there was some evil genius who thought this all up. I think that it was just done out of necessity, and now that it's understood, this really works. This is, if you want to harness control over society, this is what you have to do. And this was a problem for countries like the Soviet Union. They proved very unable, very inefficiently able to harness the resources at their demand, because people were slaves. You can have lots of slaves, and that can be scary or whatever. But there's a huge difference between a slave army and a motivated army, an army that believes that they have a stake in it. That army is going to win almost every time. And the thing is, there's still going to be elites in that culture. The fact that people are voting doesn't mean that they are, quote, in control in any meaningful sense. It means that they are allowing themselves to be controlled just in a different way. So I'd love to hear what people think. Again, this is not to say it's morally wrong necessarily to vote, although I do think that voting is akin to governing in a sense, at least rhetorically, and that I don't know that you have the right to govern other people. You certainly should be able to govern yourself, and if you want to enter into a voluntary electoral arrangement with a group of people, that's fine. Just imposing that on others is quite dubious. But I'm not gonna. That's the system that we live in. People didn't create that system, and if you think that voting can help in some way, I rather doubt that in almost all cases. But if you think that this is the one, knock yourself out. I just normally have better things to do with my time. So anyway, I'll keep it short here, relatively, and talk to you all another day. Bye bye.